Well, introduce yourself.
My name is Pearlie Craft Dove. I'm a Greater Baby, a long-term resident. Okay. My name is Pearlie Dove, a Greater Baby, a long-time resident of the city of Atlanta. My family, like many families in Atlanta, started in the old Fourth Ward. And when we had to move because of a great fire in 1917, and as you know, a lot of the land was destroyed, they decided to branch out. And fortunately, my aunties were assigned to the old Ashby Street School. Without cars, they needed transportation, so they wanted to move so they could be in walking distance. I was in the first grade. I was 5 years old in 1926. One of the most interesting things that happened that Atlanta is not aware of generally is the fact that when I arrived in that September, the school had been set on fire, and as a result of that, it was charred. The result was because Ashby Street and Hunter Street were the breaking points of segregation in Atlanta, that area. And as the whites had to move further down Ashby Street toward Fox, which was moving toward Bankhead, that way of retaliation when they gave the school to blacks was to set it on fire. I won't tell the story of what happened to us in terms of how they scattered up, but just a little incident. I went to Booker T. Washington High School in the first grade because the principal said the first grade students, the first place that we could go as a class was to E.A. Ware School. I think you might know it up there. It's near the University of Simpson. And to walk from Ashby and Hunter Street with no kind of a cover over the terrain, he thought it would just be devastating. So he said he would find a place for us to have our class. The most interesting thing back that was I was in the first grade when they installed the signature of Booker T. Washington High School. That was the replica of the statue of Booker T. Washington High. I will move on because I think we want to get into some of the other things. After you've been here 93 years, it's really kind of hard. But I want to start with the civil rights movement, and I may come back to some of things because this is what you wanted me to talk about. Fortunately, the Atlanta University system and the community are interwoven, and one impacts the other. The one thing that happened as a result of the civil rights movement was the fact that as a group, some of us felt that the civil rights movement should be on skates, and there were others who felt that that was going too fast. So as a result, we had camps among our people. One of the star characters was C.A. Scott, who was the editor of the only daily paper we had. And most of the younger people felt that his conservative viewpoint was not being spread through the community. So as a result, one of the things that came out of the Atlanta University Center movement was the establishment of another paper, which you know today as the Inquirer. Many of the professors at Morehouse and Clark and AU were instrumental with Jesse Hill, who was a civic lead at that time, and they started the Inquirer as an answer to those people who wanted to move more quickly and to have other viewpoints. I remember that some of the students at Clark College, David Stanley, who majored in English, and Ernest Farr, were young students who worked with Jesse Hill. And fortunately, I also taught John Smith because the Morehouse boys who were studying to be teachers, most of them took their methods course at Clark. And John was one of the students that I taught. And we have remained friends through the years. And I've seen his paper grow, and I've seen many people who started, who went on to do other things. Now, counter to the Inquirer, very shortly after that, we had Mr. Clayton, who started The Voice. So it's very interesting as the white community was reducing the number of papers, and we only have one paper, which was the merged Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and we have 3 papers that are still functioning from that particular movement, that is the Inquirer. There is The Voice, and there are a lot of others that aren't as prominent, like the Rolling Stones. So we can say that as a result of Atlanta, I think there's one very other interesting story. Many people ask, did you ride with the Freedom Ride? They don't understand there are so many components, and there are many people that you don't see their names, or they don't have statues, and they don't have this. But I would like to tell the story just about a student. I will not call his name because he's still living. On Boulevard, many of you may not know, they are still standing, some apartments.
Getting too loud up here.
Somebody turned on the TV or the radio.
You can hear it in here.
And at that time, the persons who kept those apartments, I guess you would call them caretakers, they were given a unit in the apartments where they stayed as the caretaker. Well, this young boy went to David T. Howard High School, and of course he had been taught about all of these great benefits. He did not discuss it with his teachers. He did not discuss it with his father, but he marched over to Grady High School to fill out the papers to transfer from David T. Howard. Of course, the principal was very aware of where blacks lived in that community. When he asked the young man his address, and he gave him address, he said, "Are you sure you live there?" Because it was only the address of the persons who stayed there, the young boy. The principal found the man who was the owner and asked him, and he said, "Oh yes, say that is my caretaker's son." Immediately, guess what he did? He fired the young man's father. Well, as a result, not only did he lose his housing, he lost his job. And that is when Jesse Hill said, if we are really going to make sure that these people who tried to help us are protected, he called together those parents who worked for the government, doctors, entrepreneurs, and so forth. And he had a meeting at what was called then Stone Hall on Morris Brown's campus. It is now called Fountain Hall. So many of us went to the meeting, and one of the young ladies' father, he was a counselor for AU Center. Her name was Madeline Nix, and she won't mind me calling her name. But in order for Madeline Nix to go to Brown High, when she was about 5 blacks among 700, every morning on Atlanta University campus, there were 5 cars that escorted her. 2 with policemen in the front, she's in the middle, and 2 in the back. When Madeline got to the high school, she never knew what was going to happen during the times when they were having, I guess you would call it lab. They might throw a rat in there, so forth. But anyway, Madeline stuck it out. She finished. Would you believe 5 years later, the ratio had reversed? There were only 5 whites and the rest of them were black. That just shows you how the civil rights shifted in just a few years. At the 20th anniversary of HOPE, which was an organization that tried to bring some sanity, they asked Madeline the question, would you do it again? And Madeline said yes. She went on to become a lawyer. She's now here, retired. The young man is in New Jersey. I will not call his name because a part of his family, is still living. But that just shows you how Jesse Hill became a person to look out for those people who were disenfranchised because they were really trying to do the right thing. The other thing is there were people who did what we call the little things that are big things, but we never know them. I understand when I was doing the research for the book and during the 40th anniversary of the Civil Rights Movement, they say there was a young, not a young, but there was a woman who would make sandwiches, catch the bus, and come to the Atlanta University Assembly with sandwiches to make sure that there was food for those students who had to do their lessons and didn't have the time to go out and find somewhere to eat. So these are the kinds of people that really helped the movement grow. And of course, you think about people like Mr. Russell, who gave money for them to get out of jail. You think of Leroy Johnson, all of these persons who really helped in the civil rights movement. Now, another facet that people don't realize, I worked with student teachers. In other words, I trained student teachers from 1949 to 1986. They too were involved because where we used to send our student teachers, black ones to black schools, that changed. And I remember my first trip was O'Keefe High School, which is now condominiums. And I remember where we used to send, say, 5 black students to David T. Howard when they were integrated. I guess numbers were important to those who had to make the assignments, and instead of sending 5, they would send 1 or they would send 2. And I remember my first encounter, and the student teacher came back and she said, she doesn't understand the black people. These were the kids who were coming from the Tech Wood homes who were coming to O'Keefe. The problem was because the white students who came from the area of Centennial, where Centennial School is now, they could go home and rest and do their homework. Most of those young boys, their mothers were on drugs, they did not have fathers, and instead of going home, they went to take whatever jobs they could to support the family. They left the job at 11 o'clock. At 11 o'clock, they were asleep and tired. They got up, and they may have been lazy, but they came, and sometimes they said that the reason was not because that they were lazy, but because of the responsibilities and the toll it was taking. So it was my job, not only, that was just one instance, to have to go and do the education of the people who were involved in student teaching. So that was another facet. So I'm not going on and on that because it just shows you how complex. In my book, someone asked me, how did I think things had grown since the time we have? I would say there are some things that have grown. We're in more schools of diverse kinds of schools. We also hold many political offices. But as Robert Frost says, we have miles and miles to go before we sleep. I would like to talk a little bit about Michael Bond's family because I've known them a long, long time, and to realize what they have meant to the city of Atlanta. I remember his grandfather when he was associated with Fort Valley State College, but I remember him most when he was,
Go ahead and give his name.
Dr. Horace Mann Bond, I'm sorry. But anyway, at the same time, I was the chair of the Department of Education at Clark. His grandfather was the chair of the Department of AU. And I was just talking before the meeting, and I said, even before we knew of a Gates who tried to trace our genetic background, that his father was interested because they had to do research to get masters. And he was trying to find out the communities from which the most talented blacks came from, and he would have them with these great big sheets to do a timeline of their various families, and you could see them. You all knew they were going to his office because you could see them. I'm sure that if he had lived, he would have been doing the same thing. Of course, he didn't have the kinds of resources that we have today, but it was a beginning. And I think many people might not have known that it was his grandfather who was a pioneer in that and many other things. He was a very brilliant gentleman. Maybe you can ask me the question of something else you would want me to talk about.
Sure. When I asked you about how the integration of Grady Memorial impacted the community, impacted the students, impacted nursing students, tell us about Grady.
Well, I guess I have a story about everything, but as you know, one side of the street was for whites and Butler, and the other side was was for the blacks. But since you triggered that, I would just like to talk about Walter White, because this is a very interesting thing about Grady before we get to the nurses. As you know, Walter White was very fair, and they lived on Houston Street, which is now named after Maynard's father. I can't think of the name of the street, grandfather. But anyway, he was ill, and they sent him to the ambulance ahead of the family. When he got to Grady, as usual, they thought he was white, so they sent him to the white side. Of course, when Walter White and the family got there, they went to the black side. And would you believe it? Transporting him from the white side to the black side. We don't know whether that was the cause of his death or not. But it really triggered the emotions of that white family, and that is why Walter was so much an integral part of the NAACP movement, because that was what had happened to his father. And it was the same thing. They had the white nurses in their little dormitory on their side and the black nurses. I happened to have been working with the YWCA group at that time, and they did not have what you would call a dean of women or anybody to work with them. And so my advisor asked me if I would go and work with the Grady girls. And it was at that time I learned how brilliant and how smart those girls were. When they had the graduation exercises, of course, they were separate. And most of the graduation exercises for the black nurses, where they were kept, was at my church, Big Bethel AME Church, which is also Jesse Hill's church on the corner of Auburn and Hill. Now I'm so accustomed to saying Butler Street. And we remember the last class to be kept when they integrated the nurses, and they moved the program from Grady to Georgia State.
So your role.
Some of them were jailed. They missed classes. And I was not only doing that, but all the other teachers who were sympathetic with the movement. Well, when they were doing their jail time, they were missing classes, and you were given tests. Well, when they came back, you couldn't give them the same test that you had given their peers. So it meant not only did you have to make tests for your regular class, but you had to make makeup tests. I think about Carolyn Long Banks. I think about Lydia Tucker Douglas. All of those were my students that I was busy using my time, in addition to all the other work I had to do to make sure. Also, we take Clarence Cooper and the young men who were trying to pass those tests to qualify for going into law. We were also helping them to learn how to take those tests so they could pass it at first take. Fortunately, he and Marvin Ayrton were able to transfer from Howard to Emory as the first blacks. And we were very proud that when it came time for them to take the test to become lawyers, because of the work that not only I had done, but all of the other people at Clark who taught the ancillary courses that they had to take, that they were able to come out and pass that examination at that time, which was very difficult.
A lot of people credit the Atlanta student movement with getting Riches to change their policy, and they staged a lot of sit-ins. Do you Want to
Oh,
talk
yes,
about? Yeah, you wanna talk about-
of course. And I remember as we used to, someone asked me, why did I use the word colored in the title of my book? Because when we used to go to Richards and the Fountains, they didn't have Negro on the top. They had colored and white where you got, your ward and so forth. But there were other places in the store that you could not go, like the Magnolia Room. You could not go to have this. And at that time, one of the counterproductive things that thing was that a lot of the people who were black at Rich's, they canceled their their subscriptions because of the way they had treated the black students. And that is when in West End, which had been kind of closed to us, they opened up in that Sears because we couldn't go to Sears either. But as a result, as you remember, Carolyn Long Banks was hired in one of the supervisory jobs there in terms of the earlier desegregation. Some of the people did go back and, take out their accounts, open them up again. Some never did, and they say some riches never wanted to come back either. But the point is that it did open up where you could go to places that you couldn't go in the store. And I remember going to the restaurant, which I think it was up on the 6th floor, and the food was really good. And I said, my gracious, we've been coming here spending all this money, but not being able to share the total services. So we have to give it to the young people who made it possible for us to have more options as we were at the store.
Beautiful. I had another story in mind, but you led me right to it. What do you feel was the overall impact?
Okay.
Loved it.
And the food was real good too.
Okay, so the overall impact of the students, and I heard they were very organized. And,
I think the impact was the fact it opened up what we call the transparency for Atlanta, and where we had very few options. For example, on our side, as I said, on the white side, you had both the Journal, which was the evening paper, and you had the Constitution, which was the morning paper. They had different editorials, and of course, as you know, the name Ralph McGill, he was one of the most, with the liberal editors. And it was Ralph McGill with the Constitution who helped with the integration as far as Atlanta and the Atlanta University Center. I remember when the civil rights movement was going on, and we had what was called the Atlanta University Summer School, which was made up of all of the colleges in the center. And they would have programs, and they would bring to the city outstanding persons of any ethnic group where they couldn't go before, but they could all come to Atlanta University. And I remember that Ralph McGill assigned a special editor to the university system, and that is how we were able to get articles in the Constitution, because before that we didn't have the freedom to have some of the people who came to speak because of the editors. But with Ralph McGill, he would send someone. Bruce Galpin was the person he sent, and Bruce would come to all of these summer school lectures regardless of who came, and we could see the articles in the Constitution, which before that time we didn't. Now, unfortunately, we don't have two newspapers now. We only have one. And even though they say, they have different viewpoints, it wasn't the same as when you had the two newspapers. So in some places we lost, and in some places we gained. Now on our side, where we only had one paper, we now have the Inquirer and the Voice and several other papers that may not be as renowned, but we have a number of sources that we can get different ideology and how people think.
The process to write the appeal for human rights, did you want to talk about that?
Yeah, well, one thing about it, Carl Holman, he was my counterpart at Clark, and he was the one who, he's an English he taught English, and he was the one that helped them to design the manifesto. And as you know, it was, they took out a whole ed in both the Constitution and the Inquirer, so that the manifesto and what the students felt were their rights was able to be shared with a greater audience than it would have been if we had not had Carl to write it, along with some other people at Spelman and the students.
Did you want to talk about SNCC at all?
I didn't know about SNCC too much. I would really like to talk about how important education has been to me, and because of Michael's grandfather and all of us who worked in the field of education. When I was able to go to Booker T. Washington High School, which was the first public high, we had an excellent principal. Do you imagine back in 1937, our curriculum required 2 foreign languages, and do you know what our first foreign language was? Latin. My second language was French. So we had to take 4 years and when we look at the watered down curriculum now, and the students don't have to take those. The other thing was that I went on and finished Booker T. Washington. We only had 1 new book the years I was there, and that was Up from Slavery. All of our other books were handed down from the white schools, and they were stamped. And our mothers would tell us, well, it doesn't matter, just put a brown covering over and learn all you can out of that book and you will succeed. And that's what we did. We went on to Atlanta University. After I finished Atlanta University and entered as a teacher at Clark, and one of the ways you move up or ascend the ladder institutions of higher learning, you have to have a doctorate. When I finished AU several years later and I wanted to move up, I could not enter any of the flagship universities at that time because they were all, most of the southern institutions were close to us. But the one thing that the civil rights did, they said if you cannot accommodate them at your flagship universities, you have to pay for them to go to a university of, of your choice. And that is how people ask me, how did you get way out to the University of Colorado? Because I couldn't go to Georgia State. And I just thought the program out there, I had read about it being a real good program. I had never gone west. But when it came time for me to go, Miss Harris, who was the Regent's secretary, she said, you can't go. And I said, why? She said, when we opened this up to, quote, your people, they decided to go to the University of Mexico, the University of California. They have used up all of the travel budget. Now, that was not my fault. And I'm not really a person to be pushed back. So I said, Miss Harris, that was her name. I said, you let me go home and talk this over with my family. It was always supportive. So we decided. They say, well, okay. Say, well, they paid the tuition. Say, yes. And they said, well, she said, you have to go, I think, you can't go west of the Mississippi. And I said, okay. When I discussed it with the family, I said, well, you all pay my tuition and give me as much money for my transportation that will take me east and I'll pay the rest of it. And, you know, not thinking about my geography, I took it to New York, and so I said, Pearlie, go to New England, you get about $10 more. But anyway, the idea is, you know, and then when I got out there and I came back, and they said, "Ooh, say," and I would tell them about the beautiful prairie and the red rocks and the scenery and how it was so nice out there. They said, "Well, you're getting a better education than we were." But halfway through it, then I guess they saw how expensive it was. Then they opened up the flagship universities, but I had gotten my doctoral dissertation approved, and it was just really been too costly, so they told me I could stay. Thank the maker, I was able to make the 2 years, and I started out in 1954, and I ended in 1959.
Anything else you want to say about the movement lawyers?
Well,
Donald Hollowell and, what was the other name? Howard Moore Jr.
who was that?
He was one of the lawyers that.
No, the ones I knew was Hollowell, and of course Leroy Johnson, and of course you know Leroy was the first black who was the Senate at the state of Georgia, and it's very interesting to know that Leroy is still here. He's still able, and those of us, I was telling somebody, old soldiers, they just fade away. And when I think about how many years I've been on this battlefield right now, I'm working with historic preservation, because even though the community in which I live, Washington Park, and many people don't know it, was founded by a black man, Heman Perry, in 1919. It was a first planned community, I might say, even white or black, but I do know. And the interesting thing about it, he was contemporary and worked with Herndon. They both had insurance companies, but Heman Perry came over and bought out a lot of land on the west side. In fact, the land that Booker T. Washington sits on was sold from Heman Perry. Heman Perry sold that. Also, he donated the land where Washington Park, and that is where he started his 15-block community called the Washington Park community. And many people don't know that he was a black man. And the other interesting thing, they're talking about choice neighborhoods. Well, in 1919, he developed the choice neighborhood because in that 15-block period, that 15-block area, we had everything we needed. We had a high school, the elementary school, a park, restaurants. We had all kind of stores. And of course, we were on the edge of the Atlanta University Center, and we could go over there, even though we couldn't go downtown. We would go over there to look at the plays that they were going to be offered. And it's just amazing that how little people know, and they think that things just started a choice neighborhood. And so what we're trying to do, we already got it on the National Historic Register, but right now we're trying to get it on the local historic register. So in time and perpetuity, people will know that this little God Greens Acres over here was started back in 1919 by a black man. And over on, well, I see Simpson all the time, but it's Boone. His original house, we got it restored. It's 996 Simpson Boone. And that is one of the places that we're trying to get a marker. We're trying to get Councilman Barn. Because when I tell people they have to, it's very hard driving and looking, but it stands out so strongly. It's right above Lowry and coming on up to Mason Turner. The original house that he, and all of the other homes in this area, he was an architect and he got people. The other interesting thing is the money to buy the more modern homes you know, he started the Citizen Trust Bank. And then during the civil rights, they had a branch that they moved out on Hunter Street. And it was this branch that gave people the money to buy the homes that they expanded out Simpson and Dixie Hills and so forth.
One last thing, and did Michael text you? Is he coming? Okay. Okay. I know he wanted to talk to you, or at least see you, but.
Well, that's okay, I'll see him.
Do you want to get a shot at the book? You want to say the name of your book and hold the book up?
The name of the book is Pearls of Wisdom from a Woman of Color. Pearls of Wisdom from a Woman of Color, Courage, and Commitment. And as I say, somebody asked me why I used the word colored and not Afro-American. I said, when I came along, we didn't use that word. We were colored.
Okay. Anything else, Tiana? Okay.
I hope you can find something you all can edit and
Oh,
use.
you said a lot. We got you. We got you covered.
Thank you.